Shalom, shalom. First, I'd like to give all praises unto Yahweh, Bahasham Yahweh Shai, and double honors unto the apostles and elders of Great Millstone, and honors to you brothers out there in the highways and the byways, teaching this word in all sincerity and in truth. And I just want to bring out this story. The title of the video is "Meet the Woman Who Learned That Her Mother Passed as White." Now we know that what we teach here, we teach about the Israelites, and we also bring out about the other nations, beginning with Esau. And we know that the so-called white man represents the Edomites today, and the Israelites are the so-called Negroes, Hispanics, and Native American Indians. And both those nations have a what's known as a archetype. They have certain physical features which are dominant among them. For instance, among the tribe of Judah, they have mainly a so-called Negroid look. Edom mainly look like who? So-called white people. That's the archetype of an Edomite. But what you're going to find out is you got people that basically the way they look doesn't necessarily line up with their actual nationality. All right, so you got so-called white people that they look like Edomites, but when you trace their actual lineage, they go back to Israelites through their father, and vice versa. Okay, so you're going to have Israelites in these last days that going to look like the archetypes of other nations, because back in their line, their fathers laid with the women of those nations, and subsequently over generations, they no longer look like the archetype of that particular tribe, but they resemble the nation of their mothers. Nevertheless, the seed is of the father, and their lineage dictates that they are of the seed of Israel. All right, and we bring out examples all the time, and the reason why we bring that out is for the spiritual understanding that you're going to have Israelites who are going to come into this truth that's not going to look like what you expect. They're not going to speak the languages you expect. They're not going to be from the lands or the countries you expect. There's going to be Israelites who are of the elect that are going to be delivered from the four corners of the earth, and they can come looking all different ways and speaking all different languages, as is determined in Revelations, the 7th chapter. And they're going to be delivered and brought back into the fold through the Spirit, through sanctification of the Spirit and belief of this word. All right, because the Lord knows those who are His, regardless of what they may look like, because the Lord operates on a higher spiritual level. All right, so he looks deeper, and His knowledge goes deeper than that of just the flesh in terms of what you look like. Okay. Now, this is Matthew 13 and 37. It says, He answered and said unto them, He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. Right? The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered together and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. All right. In fact, when you go back up to the parable, because that's the breakdown, it says, let's start from verse 27. So the servants of the household came and said unto him, Sir, didst thou not sow good seed in thy field? From whence then have it tares? He said unto them, An enemy hath done this. The servant said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Now the wheat is twofold. This parable is twofold, because on one hand it represents the nation of Israel versus the other nations. The nation of Israel being that good seed, right? And the other nations being the tare. But there's a level of the parable which actually applies to within the nation of Israel. You got the elect, and then you got the 2/3. The elect represent that good seed among Israel, and the 2/3 the tares represent the 2/3. All right. Now the level we're dealing with is on the national level, right? Among the Israelites, the other nations have sown their seed, right? Beginning with the so-called white man, throughout so-called slavery, and even unto this day, you have Edomite men who lay down with so-called black women, and they have children with the so-called black women, so-called Hispanic women, and so on, and they have sons by them. And those sons then lie down with other women of our nation. So after a process of time, right, it can be that the Edomite seed now takes on the form or the look of an Israelite. So you got Israelites, you got people out there that are so-called Negro, Hispanic, and Native American Indians who are actually physically tares. They are physically not of the seed of the kingdom. They're physically not of the nation of Israel. They look like Israelites, but they're not. But it also applies the other way around. The Israelite man has sown seed also among the other nations. So you got members of the other nations that look like them, but really they're Israelites. And now that that's been said, it brings me back to this video. So let's play this, and you're going to see that this woman's mother, even though she looked like a so-called white woman, she really wasn't. And she did her best to hide it, because obviously she knew there was a stigma in America, especially back then, even more so, with being associated with the so-called Negroes. All right, so you back then, if you could pass for being white, you hid the fact that you had so-called Negro or Hispanic or Native American Indian heritage. All right, because they just like today are under the system of white supremacy. So her mother hid the fact from even her husband that her father was a so-called black man, and her family where she came from was so-called Negroes. All right, and she only found out towards the end of her mother's life, which is going to show you that. In fact, let's prove one thing, that ultimately your nationality is not determined by what you look like, and it's not determined by your mother, it's determined by your father. So technically this woman here, her mother was an Israelite, but she might not be an Israelite. She's probably an Edomite, because her mother married a so-called white man who was probably more than likely an Edomite. So she's not really even of the same nationality as her mother. All right? If you have that understanding. This is Numbers 1:18. And they assembled all the congregation together on the first day of the second month, and they declared their pedigrees after their families by the house of their fathers, according to the number of the names, from 20 years old and upward, by their polls. So your pedigree is determined by the house of your fathers. All right? Patriarchy. The seed is of the man. All right? So now that's been said, I know it's a bit long. I just wanted to lay down the scriptures. We can play this.
Secretive mother, a grandfather she had never met, and a family history that she never suspected. Gail Lucasa could not have predicted what she would discover when she decided to dig into her mother's mysterious past. Watch.
This is my mom and dad. And as far as I know, my father went to his grave never knowing my mom's secret. My parents met during World War II. My mom was an absolutely stunningly beautiful woman.
So that's her mother. Now you might look at her and say, "Oh yeah, that's a so-called white woman." Well, guess what? Her father's a so-called Negro. How about that? So she's actually an Israelite. She's a Judite. She's of the tribe of Judah. See, because this thing really ain't about black. We're not black nationalists and all that crap. Black identity, no. Now, are we a people of color predominantly? Yes. Right? But we don't look, man, you're going to have Israelites that don't look so-called black or might not be of color because of the curse with leprosy or whatever the case may be. All right? We ain't like these Afrocentrist clowns that take melanin and hype like as if you have melanin, you're going to fly through the sky. It's just normal, man. right? Having color in your skin is just normal. There's nothing special about it. Esau is abnormal. The so-called white man is abnormal. There's nothing special about melanin. Every animal, it's just normal, man. It's like having two hands and two eyes. It's normal. There's nothing special about having two hands. There's nothing special about having two eyes. It's how we're supposed to be. You know, these Afrocentrists, you know, Kundalini and melanin gonna react with the sun and you're gonna fly off like a rocket. It's all bullshit, man. What makes us a special people ain't our skin color. What makes us special is that we are the chosen seed of Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahushai. Because you got Hamites that are dark as hell, but they're not a special people. All right? So we bring out things about the color of skin for the truth's sake. The Israelites are mainly a people of color, and they always have been. The so-called white man, the Edomite man who lacks color, they're the Edomites. But we have to balance it and show wisdom and understanding that because of certain mixing that's gone on, you're going to have basically exceptions to the rule. You're going to have people that don't fit into the archetype.
My dad, he had a great sense of humor. He served in the Pacific. He was very proud of that.
In 1944, after the war, Harold Kalina married Alvera Frederick. They settled in a working-class neighborhood in Parma, Ohio. In 1946, their daughter Gail was born. Throughout her childhood, Gail says her mother mystified her in some ways.
She was very meticulous about her makeup. She would wear a light foundation makeup to bed at night, which I thought was a little strange. She would never go out in the sun unless she had a wide brim.
And you got a lot of Israelite women that do that to this very day. Bleach and all them thing there and them hide from the sun. Because they want to be lighter. Which all goes back to white supremacy. And not just Israelite women, you got Israelite men doing that too. Yeah, that's how much this Esau has destroyed the minds of our people. Okay? And made us hate being normal. It's crazy, man. That's why when we get you Edomites, man, it's gonna be it's just gonna be what it's gonna be. There ain't gonna be no mercy. You're gonna get messed up real bad. I can't even put it into words. I can't even express it completely. You just gonna have to experience it, then you're gonna understand.
She would cover her hands with gloves. Really didn't like to be in the sun.
But Gail says the biggest mystery was her mother's selective memory when talking about her own father, Azimar Frederick.
I said, Mom, when was he born? When did he die? Oh, I don't know. I can't remember.
Growing up, Gail never saw one photo of her grandfather. Finally, in 1995, when she was 48, she decided to search for his identity, combing through microfilm.
At first, I couldn't find him. Then I put in the 1900 Louisiana census records, and suddenly I see the name Azimah Frederick. There are all these Fredericks in the same household. Then I noticed something else very curious. Next to all their names is the letter B. So I go to the head of that column to see what it stands for, and it says race. So B, does that mean black?
Gail wanted to confront her mother, but first she reached out to the state of Louisiana, requesting her mother's birth certificate.
I pretended I was my mother and that I had lost my birth certificate. I opened that birth certificate, and there in parentheses were 3 letters, C-O-L. So I wrote to the state again and said, my birth certificate said C-O-L. Would you please explain to me what that means? They sent me a very official letter back, and they said, C-O-L is for colored. I just was speechless. I didn't know if my mother knew, but I'm thinking, how could she not know this? And why has she never said anything to me?
We're joined now by Gail Lukasik, who has written about her mother's secret past in a new book, White Like Her. Welcome, Gail.
Thank you very much.
Great to see you here. So you did finally work up the nerve to ask your mother about this birth certificate. It took you 2 years, but you finally sat down with her. You knew it had to be face-to-face.
Yes, it had to be. This is not a conversation you have on the telephone.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you asked her why she's listed as, quote, colored on the birth certificate.
I did. I told her I'd found her birth certificate. It said colored. And she became very indignant with me. And she said, I don't know what birth certificate you have, but mine says I'm white. So I thought, well, wait a minute. So I said, Mom, I have some other documents that I could show you. The census records, your father's listed as black.
The funny thing is, when it's revealed exactly who and what Esau is, and his judgment, manifests, even the Edomites ain't gonna want to be Edomites in that day. All you Israelites out there that want to be so-called white, who want to be the Edomite man, you want to be the Edomite woman. When you see the judgment that the Most High gonna put on Esau, you gonna get down on your hands and your knees, and you're going to thank and praise Yahweh Hashem Yahweh Shai that Jacob, you are the father. And Esau, you are not the father, okay? You don't want that man. Listen, you don't want Esau to be your father, man. That's a fate worse than death. All right? It's better to die than let that be true. All right? It's better your father was a dog than be an Edomite. Trust me, because the Esau is the worst thing in creation. And that's what you're going to find out. That's going to manifest itself real soon. So in the kingdom, ain't no, but everyone, even the heathen are going to thank Yahweh Hashem Yahweh Shai that they're not of the seed of Esau. All right? It ain't about that. Trust me.
And I have a letter from the state of Louisiana saying that COL means colored. Well, she got very quiet, very quiet. And she's sitting in this large chair, and it almost seemed like the chair was swallowing her because she got very small. And she looked at me and she said, you have to promise me you will never tell anyone until after I die. And then she said, because how will I hold my head up with my friends if they know?
Wow.
You see? Because she knew that she spent so many years among these so-called white people and heard them say so many different things. Because when these so-called white people get together and there ain't no so-called black people around, they speak their mind freely. All right? Because right now we're in the what's known as the politically correct era, which Edomites are getting so hurt nowadays that we're starting to come out of that era anyway. The Edomites more and more, they stop hiding behind anonymous comments online and they're starting to say shit out and bold because they got nothing to lose. But we've been in the PC era. See, there was an era when the so-called white man would just speak his mind. He didn't give a damn. But then came that politically correct era where they would be racist, but behind closed doors. Her mother grew up she grew up from the time when before it was PC to during PC. And she knew exactly how so-called white people felt about so-called black people. And she knows that the friends that she has would never have been her friends if they knew. So she was living in her own hell. Imagine that, when you know who and what you are, and you gotta stand there buddying with people that you know that if they knew the truth about who you were, would flipping hate you. That's a hell in itself.
What year was that?
That was 1997 when I confronted her.
So she had spent her adult life passing.
Yes.
A term you use in the book. Can you tell the audience what that is?
She was passing for white. My mother, if you look at the photographs of her, she visually does look white. But on her, her birth certificate and the census record, she's listed as colored or black. So when she decided to marry my father, who, by the way, is white, she moved north to Ohio. And from that moment on, she took on the white race that she passed.
This isn't an isolated case. There's a lot of Jake in America who, because they were born light enough to pass for being so-called white, they made the transition.
She went from being designated black to being designated white.
You write in the book about that moment you saw COL and understood that to mean, quote, colored, and write about it as the day I found out I wasn't who I thought I was.
Yes.
What did you go through upon this realization?
The initial discovery was 1995 when I was at the Family History Center. I always think about this. I walked into that Family History Center, a white woman, totally convinced I was a white woman. And I walked out of there and I didn't know what I was. I didn't know if
you knew the scriptures, you would know you still are what your father is.
was mixed race. I didn't know if I was black, if I was still white.
There's really no such thing as being mixed race. All right, you are what your father is. There ain't no confusion.
No idea. It was shocking to me. You know, it's like finding out you're another person that you didn't know.
Right, and your mom is another person. I know you write in the book about how you feel now in retrospect. She left clues for you like little breadcrumbs through the forest. And we're going to talk about what some of those were, along with the fact that Gail says her own dad was a bigot and her mom knew it. We'll get into that next. And we're back now with Gail Lukasik, who discovered a whole new family when she uncovered her mother's secret. Her mom had an African-American father, a mixed-race mother, and she had run away from her past and had been passing as white since she was a young woman. Gail, thank you again. So talk about those clues like breadcrumbs you wrote about.
Well, my mother had some quirky habits that you know, as a child, you accept your mother's quirky habits, right? That's my mother. She would never went out into the sun unless she had a hat on, many times gloves, so she avoided the sun. And she never wanted to visit home, which I thought was odd. I asked her one time, can we visit your family in New Orleans? And no, it would depress me too much to visit home. And here's the strangest one for me, is that she always wore makeup to bed, a little light foundation. And as I got older, I did question that. I said, Mom, how come you wear makeup to bed? And she said, well, Gail, you know, you never know if you would get sick in the middle of the night and the ambulance would come, and you always want to look your best because you'll get treated better at the hospital. It's like, oh, okay.
All right. Something to think about. So now your mom decides to pass as white before she married your dad, but she marries your dad, who's in the Army.
Right.
And you write openly in the book about how he was a bigoted man.
He was. I think he was a typical man of his generation and his upbringing. Mm-hmm. You know, he was bigoted at home. You know, he would, if he saw something on television that inspired him, he might use a racial slur, or if he saw something in the newspaper. And so...
Only imagine how that made her feel.
I think she would say, like, oh, hell, you know, you really shouldn't talk that way. But she wasn't like, oh, you cannot talk that way. It was more, you know, because she couldn't get
right,
too
you
strong.
think there's a reason. There's a reason she was measured.
I think she had to, you know, dial it back a little because she didn't want to give herself away.
That's hell. But anyway, you can watch the whole thing, man. But point is, her mother was light enough to look like a so-called white woman, but she was actually an Israelite, man. Just like the elders have been teaching for years, man. It's just facts, you know. You got a lot of these Israelites. They get emotional, they get angry because they're on this black power movement type thing. But this really ultimately is not about skin color. That's not the end all and be all of the whole deal. This is about the seed of Israel, the chosen seed, the seed of Abraham, the Most High's friend. And if you're of that seed, and then furthermore to that, you're of the elect, then you're going to receive this gospel. And there's nothing nobody can do about that. Because this thing ain't of flesh. This is really of the spirit of Yahweh Hashem Yahushai. And in these last days, many Israelites going to come into this thing, into the faith of Yahushai. And a lot of them ain't going to look like Israelites. Some people, they're going to be offended. But that's because they're carnal. They're not spiritual. So with that, I'm going to say shalom.